Something is breaking open right now in the Persian Gulf, and most Americans have no idea how deep it actually goes. Iran's Revolutionary Guard just announced it shot down a United States F-18 Super Hornet over the southern coast near Chabahar, sending it crashing into the Indian Ocean. And that's not all. Tehran is calling this the fourth successful interception of Western military aircraft using fully indigenous, domestically built air defense systems. The Pentagon said it's false. CENTCOM stamped the word false on their social media posts and insisted no U.S. fighter aircraft have been lost. But here's what nobody in the mainstream press is stopping to ask. Why does this keep happening? Why is Iran making these specific claims repeatedly with video footage in front of the entire watching world while simultaneously launching Qadir cruise missiles at the USS Abraham Lincoln and forcing a carrier group to reposition? Because there is a much bigger story underneath all of this. One about power, about the limits of American military supremacy, about what this war is really costing, and about where it is almost certainly headed next. This war, Operation Epic Fury, has now entered its fourth week. It started on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated surprise airstrikes on multiple cities and military installations across Iran. The opening blow killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei along with several other senior Iranian officials. It was the most audacious military action the United States had taken in decades, and Trump characteristically sold it to the American public as something clean and decisive. He told reporters in those first few days that Iran had no navy, no air force, no radar, no detection systems, essentially nothing left. He said, and I'm paraphrasing almost nothing here, that just about everything's been knocked out. That was less than a month ago. So let's sit with that for a moment, because it matters enormously. If everything was knocked out in the first week, then how is it that at least 16 US aircraft, including several MQ-9 Reaper drones, have been lost since the conflict began on February 28th? How is it that Iran's Navy is still firing cruise missiles at American carriers? How is it that Iran's IRGC is releasing footage of jets going unstable mid-air? Something in the official narrative isn't adding up. And when official narratives don't add up, that's precisely the moment when you need to stop letting the television think for you and start asking the questions that actually matter. Let's start with the aircraft losses, because this is the part that should genuinely concern every single American taxpayer and every family that has a son or daughter in uniform right now. On March 1st, 3 US F-15E Strike Eagle fighter jets were shot down in a friendly fire incident involving a Kuwaiti F-18. All 6 crew members ejected safely and were recovered. Now, friendly fire in a complex multi-nation air operation is not unusual historically. It is a terrible tragedy when it happens, but it happens. The real question is what comes next, and what comes next has been a steady drumbeat of Iranian claims about hitting Western aircraft. Iran says it targeted an F-35 Lightning II. Then it says it hit an F-18. The IRGC described the F-18 incident as the fourth successful interception of strategic fighter jets belonging to the hostile US and Zionist military by Iran's fully indigenous modern air defense systems. CENTCOM denies every single claim. But think about what's happening from a strategic communication standpoint. Iran isn't making these claims in a vacuum. They are making them to a domestic audience that needs to believe the government can defend the nation, and they are making them to a global audience, particularly in the global south, that is watching very carefully to see if the United States military is as invincible as it has always claimed. And this is where the story gets philosophically deep, because the question of whether those jets were actually downed matters less, in some ways, than the question of why the perception matters so much. The United States has built its entire post-Cold War foreign policy on a foundation of unquestioned military supremacy. The logic of American dominance has always rested on the assumption that challenging the US military is simply futile, that the technology gap is so vast, the logistics so overwhelming, the firepower so absolute, that any rational actor would simply capitulate before the cost became unbearable. That logic is what underpinned the entire Iran maximum pressure strategy that Trump ran in his first term, and that Biden quietly continued, and that Trump doubled down on when he returned to office. The idea was simple: squeeze them economically until they break, and if they don't break, remind them what the military option looks like. But what happens when that foundation starts to crack, even just at the edges? Defense experts said that if Iran's claims that it has successfully targeted an F-35 aircraft are true, this will prove that an F-35 is not invulnerable in war. This would be significant, not because it means stealth is becoming obsolete, but because it would show that even an F-35 is not invulnerable in a dense, adaptive air defense environment. That quote is from Ali Vaez, director of the Iran project at the International Crisis Group, and he is being careful and measured with his words. But let me say the same thing a different way. If a country that has been under devastating sanctions for years, that has just had its supreme leader killed, that has had its military infrastructure pummeled by thousands of strikes, can still credibly threaten the most advanced fighter jet on the planet, then the entire strategic calculus of American foreign policy needs to be revisited urgently by people who are willing to think clearly rather than simply reassure themselves. Now, let's talk about the USS Abraham Lincoln, because this is another thread that keeps pulling at the seams of the official story. Iran's Navy fired Qaeda cruise missiles at the USS Abraham Lincoln, forcing it to change position. Tehran described the move as asserting maritime sovereignty. Rear Admiral Shahram Irani stated that the US carrier group is constantly being monitored and any hostile approach will face powerful strikes. The Pentagon has not responded to the latest claim. Trump said Iran fired more than 100 missiles at the Abraham Lincoln and every single one was knocked down. But here is what is quietly significant about that. A carrier group moving position in response to incoming fire is a massive logistical event. It doesn't happen casually. Carriers don't just drift a few miles to the left. Moving a carrier strike group is a deliberate operational decision made under pressure. Whether the missiles hit or not, and the defensive systems on American carriers are genuinely formidable, the fact that Iran can still project enough force to influence the movement of a carrier group means the war is not going the way the public is being told it is going. The International Energy Agency head Fatih Birol warned that the global economy faces a major threat from the war's disruption to oil and gas flows. No country will be immune to the effects of this crisis if it continues to go in this direction, he said, adding that the current situation was worse than the combined oil crises of 1973 and 1979, which together lost 10 million barrels per day. At least 40 energy facilities across 9 countries have been severely damaged in the conflict. Read that again. Worse than 1973 and 1979 combined. Those two oil shocks fundamentally reshaped the global economy. They caused recessions. They restructured geopolitical alliances. They forced the United States to pivot its entire Middle East strategy towards securing energy supplies, and now we are potentially looking at something worse, while a significant portion of the American media remains focused on whether Trump looks strong enough or whether Iran's missile videos are authentic. The energy dimension of this conflict is something I want you to hold on to because it connects directly to where the pressure on Trump is actually coming from. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic feature on a map. About 1/5 of the world's oil passes through the strait, but Iran has essentially blocked most traffic since the start of the war. Iranian state-affiliated news agencies reported Iran's parliament is planning to formalize fees for ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Formalizing fees through a waterway that is internationally recognized as open passage is not a legal position. It is a power move. It is Iran saying, we may be under attack, but we still control something you cannot afford to ignore. And in a global economy that runs on energy, that is an extraordinarily consequential card to play. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper said the strait is physically open, but argued ships are staying away because Iran was firing missiles and drones at vessels. So it's open in the technical sense that the water is still there, but functionally closed because nobody wants to sail through a missile corridor. That's the distinction that matters in the real economy, not the semantic one. Global shipping insurers have already pulled coverage. Tanker rates have spiked, energy markets are volatile, inflation pressure is building, and American consumers are going to feel all of this in gas prices, in food prices, in the cost of everything that moves on a truck or a ship. Now let's come to the diplomatic dimension, because this is where things get truly complicated and where you start to see the real shape of the pressure that Trump is under. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, said the U.S. presented a 15-point action list that forms the framework for a peace deal with Iran, through Pakistan acting as mediator. Pakistan's foreign minister confirmed his country is facilitating indirect talks between the US and Iran and said the 15 points are being deliberated upon by Iran. So there are talks, or rather there are indirect talks. Messages being passed through intermediaries because neither side wants to be seen as blinking first. That is how major power negotiations actually work when pride and domestic politics are both on the line. Nobody announces the compromise before it's ready. You send messages, you probe positions, you use trusted third parties to test the water. Pakistan, interestingly enough, is playing that role here. A country that has warm ties with both Washington and Tehran, which puts it in a genuinely unique position. But here's what Iran said in response. Iran's conditions to end the war, end to aggression by the enemy, concrete guarantees preventing the recurrence of war, clear determination, guaranteed payment of war damages and compensation, comprehensive end to the war across all fronts, including against all resistance groups, recognition of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. That last one, recognition of sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, is not a minor ask. It is not a face-saving gesture. It is a fundamental restructuring of the legal and political status of one of the most economically vital waterways on the planet. The United States has never recognized Iranian sovereignty over the strait, and doing so would upend decades of international maritime law and effectively hand Iran a permanent veto over global energy flows. That is not a negotiating position you offer when you're losing. That is a negotiating position you offer when you believe the other side is under enough pressure to take it seriously. And perhaps they are. Senate Republicans on Tuesday again stopped Democrats from forcing an end to the Iran war without explicit congressional authorization, marking the third failed attempt since President Donald Trump launched the offensive last month. 3 attempts in less than a month to end a war that has barely started. That is significant. The opposition isn't coming from fringe voices, it is coming from enough senators to keep trying, and the fact that it keeps failing by slim margins tells you something about where Republican unity on this war actually stands. There are people in Trump's own coalition who are watching the costs accumulate and starting to ask the hard questions privately. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued one of his starkest warnings yet, saying the war has spun out of control and that the world is staring down the barrel of a wider war. Guterres called on all sides to reverse course before the region slides into an even more dangerous phase, saying it is time to stop climbing the escalation ladder and start climbing the diplomatic ladder. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. UN Secretary General statements are often dismissed as toothless moralizing, and frankly, that dismissal is often warranted. But what Guterres is reflecting here is not just his own opinion. He is reflecting the consensus of the vast majority of the international community, including many of America's traditional allies, who are watching this war with genuine alarm and whose support the United States is going to need for whatever comes next. Germany notably has spoken out. Germany's Defense Minister Pistorius said, while Germany would not be getting involved in the war, they could help secure the vital economic waterway once a ceasefire is agreed. He was referring to Trump calling NATO allies cowards after they declined his request to help the US reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Trump called NATO allies cowards, the same alliance that has underpinned American security architecture since 1949, the same partners whose intelligence cooperation, logistical support, and diplomatic cover have made American military power sustainable across decades. Trump called them cowards because they wouldn't join a war they had no say in starting. That is not just a rhetorical flourish. That is a statement of profound strategic isolation, and it has consequences that will outlast this particular conflict by years, possibly decades. Let's talk about what's happening on the ground, because the human cost is what grounds all of this analysis in reality. At least 13 US service members have been killed during combat operations against Iran, and roughly 200 others have been wounded. Those are not statistics. Those are people. Those are families. And the official narrative has consistently been that this is a clean, controlled, technologically superior operation with minimal American casualties. 13 dead and 200 wounded in less than a month is not minimal. For context, that pace of casualties, if sustained, would put this among the costlier recent American military engagements in terms of lives per unit time. As of March 23rd, Krainer estimated that at least 15% of the total human casualties had been under the age of 18. That is a statistic that should stop every American in their tracks. 15% of the dead are children, not combatants, not military-age adults, children, and this is being conducted in America's name, funded by American taxpayers, with American aircraft and American ordnance. This is not about whether Iran is a good actor. It clearly is not in many respects. This is about what we are doing and whether the stated objectives justify the actual costs, human and strategic and financial and moral. Israel's defense ministry said Defense Minister Israel Katz and Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir approved a new round of targets in Iran and Lebanon. The Israeli military has already fired more than 15,000 munitions across Iran since the war began on February 28th, over 4 times the number used during the 12-day confrontation with Iran last June. Several waves of strikes had been carried out against government-linked infrastructure in Tehran, including production facilities in Isfahan involving sites said to be developing submarines. 15,000 munitions in less than a month. That is an extraordinary rate of fire, and it is also deeply revealing about where the operational priorities are. Submarine production facilities in Isfahan, that's not battlefield necessity, that's long-range strategic disarmament. That's Israel using this war to eliminate Iranian military capabilities that won't be relevant for years. The war has multiple agendas running simultaneously, and they don't all point in the same direction. Trump weighs whether to seize Karg Island, the home of Iran's main oil processing facility. The US attacked Karg Island earlier in the war, with Trump saying the US bombed Iranian military targets there but spared the key oil infrastructure. Analysts say such an operation to seize and hold the island would be militarily challenging. Even inserting US forces so close to Iran's shores would be risky and carry the potential for casualties, says Caitlin Talmadge, an expert in US military strategy and the Persian Gulf at MIT. And then there's the question of sustaining that US military presence on the island. This is the fork in the road that nobody is talking about clearly enough on American television. Seizing Karg Island would be a massive escalation, an actual ground occupation of Iranian territory. It would lock the United States into a much longer, much more expensive, and much more dangerous commitment. It would almost certainly trigger a full escalation of Iranian proxy attacks across the region, and it would fundamentally change the character of what this operation is, from a limited air campaign into something that looks a great deal more like the opening of a long war. And yet the pressure to do it exists, because the alternative, letting Iran retain control of its oil infrastructure while the strait remains functionally closed, means the economic damage to the global economy continues to compound. This is the trap that major powers fall into when wars don't end quickly. You either escalate to force a resolution, or you accept a stalemate that drains you. Neither option is good. Both options are being actively considered. Iran doubled down, threatening to completely close the Strait of Hormuz and strike vital infrastructure across the region, such as energy and desalination facilities critical for drinking water. Desalination facilities. That is targeting the water supply of civilian populations in countries that have nothing to do with this war. That is what desperation looks like. Not the rational calculation of a state managing its interests, but the lashing out of a government that has had its supreme leader killed, its military pummeled, its economy destroyed, and is now trying to hold together enough domestic legitimacy to survive in some form. Understanding that desperation doesn't mean excusing it, but it does mean taking it seriously as a variable in whatever comes next, because desperate actors do things that rational actors wouldn't. Here is what I want to leave you with, because I think this is the most important framing for everything happening right now, the frame that allows all of these events to make sense when viewed together rather than in isolation. The headline is Iran claiming it shot down a US F-18, a claim that dominates the immediate news cycle and captures attention. The real story is that we are 4 weeks into a war that was supposed to be over quickly, and it isn't over. It has not resolved in the way it was initially presented. The diplomatic track is stalled, not moving forward in any meaningful or visible way. The military track is producing casualties and costs that weren't publicly acknowledged, costs that were not part of the original narrative. Trump floated the idea of winding down military efforts in the Persian Gulf, which tells you something crucial, something that cannot be ignored if you're paying attention to the signals being sent. He is looking for an exit. He is considering how to step back from the situation. Not because he's losing militarily in a conventional sense. The US military has done enormous damage to Iran's infrastructure, damage that is real and measurable, but because the strategic objectives are not meeting the political realities, because what was intended is not aligning with what is unfolding. You cannot simultaneously claim total victory and pursue back-channel negotiations through Pakistan. You cannot maintain both positions at the same time. You cannot tell the American public that Iran has nothing left and then explain why the war needs to continue. You cannot sustain that contradiction without it becoming visible. You cannot call your allies cowards and then expect them to help you manage the aftermath. You cannot undermine them and rely on them in the same breath. The pressure on Trump is real, it is multidimensional, and it is coming from every direction at once. It is not coming from a single source, but from multiple overlapping pressures. From the Senate, from allies, from the global economy, from the UN, from the battlefield itself, with every Iranian missile that forces a carrier to reposition, or every drone that gets through the defensive net, each of these adds weight to the situation. And the Iranian claims about downed jets, true or false, are part of a deliberate strategy to add psychological pressure to that pile, to increase the sense of cost and exposure.